Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Dr. Jamie Woodcock. I'm based at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm very pleased, as always, to come to NPTEL-NOC and to be able to speak to the Winter School. What I'm going to talk about today is digital labour platforms, how digital work is changing, and probably a bit about the future of work as well. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a project that I'm running with Professor Mark Graham, my colleague at the Oxford Internet Institute, and some field work that we're going to be doing in Bangalore as well. What I thought I would do is talk for a while and leave some time for discussion at the end. But if anybody has any questions or comments as we're going through, I think it would be great to break up some of the talk with comments or questions as well. So what I wanted to start with is why I think work is important to talk about. Now, partly I think work is important to talk about because I'm a sociologist of work, so it's what I study, so I'm going to tell you that it's really important. But I also think it's important when we think about how most of us are going to have to spend most of our lives working, unless you've worked out some wonderful plan that's going to involve you not having to do it. Most of you are going to have to work for most of your lives. It shapes how we interact with the world, how we interact with each other, and structures our relationships to various resources, to money, to power, to capital. And so when we try to understand societal changes, try to understand the role of technology or change in society, work gives us one way to access that. Because it's through work that hopefully our needs are met, although often people's needs are increasingly not being met through work. But it's also how society is constantly made and remade. Think about how you got to IIITB today. Think about all the different kinds of work and different workers you relied upon to be here. Think about the workers required to make IIITB run on a day-to-day basis. All of those kinds of work allow us to sit here and talk about work in a more abstract way. And why I think work is interesting as a site of research, and this is something I always come back to when talking about platforms. If you talk about something on the scale of Uber, I think it's always important to come back to the particularities of work when we're studying it. So what is work? Well, work is the buying and selling of labour power, of people's time. No matter whether you're working in a university, working for Uber, you're a software developer or a cleaner, there is still something common to that relationship, which is somebody is buying your time. Now, the buying and selling of time is a very particular phenomenon. The buyer, whether it's Uber or IIITB or whoever else, the employer, always wants to get the most out of that purchase they can. Think about my job at Oxford University. Once they've bought my time, they want me to write papers. They want me to teach students to do all the other things that academics are meant to do. But think about the seller. It's not in my interest to write 1,000 papers a year or to spend all of my time teaching. And so there's always that tension. How much is somebody going to get out of the time that they've bought from somebody else? How many things is a factory worker going to make? How many square feet is a cleaner going to clean? And so the reason I want to talk about this is there's always an indeterminacy at work. There's always an ambiguity. When someone's time is bought, how is it going to convert into profit or revenue or whatever else for a company? And for platforms, this relationship can be different. It can be different to other ways of doing it. But ultimately, these problems of work still remain common across all different kinds of work. So I've used a couple of examples of different kinds of work, but what I want to talk about in this talk is digital labour. And what I mean by this, in essence, is two different things. So the first is new kinds of online work. And I always use the example of my granddad to make sense of this. Is my granddad would have no idea what online freelancing is. He just wouldn't understand it as a concept. He never had a mobile phone. He tried to never use computers if possible. And so he just wouldn't understand what online freelancing is. It's a very new kind of work to him. Software development, graphic design on computers, these kind of new forms of work. But what my granddad would have understood very well, partly because he liked getting them rather than taking the tube in London, is he'd understand things like platform taxis. He'd understand those traditional kinds of work that have become digitized. You know, he had takeaways delivered to his house. He took taxis from place to place. However, he probably would have refused to ever download the Uber app and take an Uber and would have preferred calling a taxi company. So when we think about digital labor, we can think about these two different kinds of work. Newly created forms of digital work and other kinds of work that have been transformed through digitalization. But what I want to talk about are two things that I want to bring up and then be quite critical about throughout the talk. So the first is artificial intelligence. And in the background of a lot of digital labor platforms is this idea that we're on the cusp of huge changes due to artificial intelligence. That many of these tasks can be done purely by computer. That we have Uber now, but artificial intelligence will drive Uber cars and get rid of taxi drivers in the future. That we might have people doing image recognition on platforms, but that computers are going to develop a way to do this without any human input. And really what this is a kind of longer version of the argument about automation, that we're on the cusp of major job loss, that these new kinds of work are going to be replaced along with huge swathes of traditional employment. And the way I want to address this is to think about what it would mean if work ended tomorrow. As I said earlier, you're probably going to have to work for all of your life and most of your life unless you come up with a great problem, a great solution to that problem. But yet at the same time, in a lot of the press, we hear that there's going to be mass unemployment through automation. There's going to be huge job loss. That suddenly we might get to do other things than work. So, I mean, the way I want to address this is to say, is the end of work likely? Well, probably not. Capitalism needs people to work. And so rather than mass job loss and unemployment or us getting to spend time doing things we actually want to do rather than work, is the reality is that whenever there's mass technological change under capitalism, it may get rid of a sector of jobs, but rather than those jobs disappearing forever, people tend to move into other forms of employment. And I always think about a part of the UK where my grandparents are from, which used to be a major shipbuilding town. It used to be somewhere where steel ships were made, where coal was mined, you know, kind of entire generations working, building ships and so on. Now, this might come as no surprise to you, but we don't build ships in the UK anymore. So this kind of industry is completely collapsed. It doesn't mean that people there have no jobs anymore. It just means they do very, very different things now. And so for many people who used to work in the shipping industry, they're now working in call centers. And in many cases, there's a direct switch from the old warehouses in the shipping industry and the coal industry to then being filled with call centers. So you have a kind of almost direct switch from manufacturing to service work. And so one of the things I want to argue is that platforms, or the rise of platforms, shows that actually this kind of work isn't disappearing, but rather more and more people are entering into these kinds of precarious employment relationships and that they're not going away. And when we talk about platforms, you know, there's a whole number that we could talk about of different kinds in various ways. But what I'm interested in this talk is to talk about platforms that share common features as digital labor platforms. That they offer tools to bring together the supply of and demand for labor. So not platforms where you might be able to sell something or where you might be able to get accommodation, but platforms that bring together the supply of and demand for labor, work platforms, essentially. And people might be familiar with this quote from Goodwin about the significance of platforms. And I always think it's worth returning to a little bit, that Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's most popular media owner, creates no content. Alibaba, the most valuable retailer, has no inventory. Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. And so when we're talking about platforms, this is what we're talking about. Intermediary companies, but some of which are bringing together the supply of and demand for labour, whereas others are doing something quite different. Now, of course, one of the unmentioned companies in this list is Amazon, which does own a lot of things. Has a huge logistics network, huge network of servers and data storage. So while we can kind of say these things don't own anything, there are companies that do and have a huge amount of control because of that. And my colleague Nick Cernicek has argued that Uber has become so widespread that it's even become the go-to way of describing these new companies. The Uber for X. So if some startup founder is proposing a platform to connect people who want to walk dogs with dogs that need walking or whatever kind of wonderful new problem they're solving, you can say, well, this is the Uber for dog walking, or the Uber for delivering frozen water, or whatever new thing people are trying to get money for. And I think this is quite significant because it shows how much of a model this has become. So what counts as a platform? What I want to argue is that a platform is a kind of intermediary. But when we think about work platforms, there's a whole spectrum of different platforms we could think about. At one end of that platform, of that spectrum of platforms, there are platforms that provide a kind of online marketplace for work. They provide a way for clients to connect with workers. They host the request for work and the response of prospective workers. Rather than customers, the requesters become closer to a client firm. You might bid for work. There's not so much control on the part of the platform. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there are platforms that exert far more control over workers. Think about Uber, Ola, Swiggy, Zomato. These are essentially employers, but using the platform model as a way to free themselves from most of the responsibility of being employers. Now, of course, across that spectrum, there are a whole variety of different forms. So we get some platforms that exert a little bit more control, a little bit less. In countries where workers are challenging platforms on the self-employment status, we find that companies begin moving further away from control, claiming that they don't exert control to prevent them having to become employers. And so we can say then, as Nick does, that platforms are a new kind of firm. Platforms in sum are a new type of firm. They're characterized by providing the infrastructure to intermediate between different user groups. So think here about Uber as an intermediary between people who want taxis and people who have a car and want to drive people around. They display monopolistic tendencies driven by network effects. Think about how with Uber, it makes sense to have as many drivers on the platform as possible, because then customers can get cabs more easily and so on. By employing cross-subsidization to draw in different user groups, in many cases, services can be offered far cheaper than they could be before. And by having a design core architecture that governs the interaction possibilities. Think here about the way Uber extracts data from its drivers. Think about how with delivery companies, you convince somebody to deliver food by only telling them one step ahead where they need to go. If you work for Deliveroo, a big delivery company in the UK, you're never told if your cycle is going to be 5 miles or 10 miles. You're only ever told the next step. So you think, it's not that far, I don't mind going and picking up that food. And so what I want to talk about now is another distinction in the kinds of platforms. So I think broadly speaking, there are 3 different kinds of work platforms we can talk about. And they can be divided into 2. So the first are platforms that require workers to be in a particular place. Think about how, if you're sat in Bangalore and you want a taxi, you want your taxi driver to be relatively near you in Bangalore. You can't order a taxi from London. Think about how the same is true with your pizza delivery, with having your house cleaned, with having care work carried out. You want the worker to be in a particular place. Now, often with these kinds of platforms, all of these kinds of work have existed before. To use my, maybe overused by the end of this presentation, example of my granddad, he would have known what all of these kinds of work were. He probably would have paid for these kinds of work at various points. The difference here is that the work process is now organized via the internet, probably through an app. And we can think about the big examples of platform working. Now, of course, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more later, this means that workers have to be in the same place. It often means that workers have to be in the same place together, and means that workers on platforms might know each other, which is a significant difference to the next kind of work. So broadly speaking, the other kind of platform work is what we could, to use an overused metaphor again, I guess, is cloud work. So thinking here about work that is organized digitally over the internet with workers completing the tasks remotely. Unlike your pizza or your taxi, it doesn't matter whether the person who completes your graphic design task or your data input task, it doesn't matter where they live, so long as they have an internet connection. And within this, there are the shorter tasks, micro work we could call it, like Amazon Mechanical Turk, image recognition, data entry, transcription, usually tasks that are very short or tasks that can be broken down from a larger piece of work into very short parts. And if anybody's not familiar with what I mean, think about the capture tasks you sometimes have to complete when you're putting your details into the internet. Now, it's kind of annoying when we have to do a capture. At least I find it annoying because I'd rather not be doing a small bit of work to get access to my data. But then imagine if you had to do those over and over again for a 12-hour day. That's the kind of work that micro workers are doing. And in a sense, it comes out of this idea that you can get people to complete these short tasks with no training. People are much, much better at recognizing numbers and words and so on than algorithms and require relatively little education to do it. A friend of mine who's an artist collected every single capture he'd ever done for Google, printed them out into a series of books. The books, when you stack them up, come to about this high. And he sent them to Google and said, this is how much work I've completed for you. I really enjoyed doing it and so on, but I would like you to pay me. Here's my invoice. Unfortunately, Google have never paid him for this, but he now takes these books around to art shows and lays them out, showing all the transcription he's done, image recognition, and so on. The second kind of work is macro work, so larger freelance tasks. We can think here about platforms like Upwork, things like graphic design, software development, and so on, longer tasks that might require more interaction with a customer. But again, can be completed, broadly speaking, from anywhere. Now, when we think about these kinds of work and how they've emerged and grown, we have to think about the context from which they come. Now, clearly technology plays a role. It'd be very difficult to manage a platform like Uber on an international scale without the kinds of technology that it uses. But what we also need to think about with these platforms is how many people are currently seeking work globally. How many people are in informal work or underemployed and are trying to gain access to labour markets in various ways. And so we've been doing fieldwork recently in South Africa. Mark's been doing fieldwork in Kenya, Uganda, and various other African countries. And everywhere you go, you see signs like this. Adverts for jobs, and increasingly, these adverts are no longer factory workers and so on, but you can earn money online. On the way here from central Bangalore, I saw adverts for earning money on your mobile, earning money from home online. These kinds of adverts are becoming more and more ubiquitous. And so for many people, finding work on a global scale is becoming less about going to a workplace, having a direct boss, and is more about going to these kinds of places. Going to an internet cafe, finding ways to access work online outside of the local labour market conditions. And so one of the things we can say is that the world is increasingly defined by increasing connectivity. Earlier this year, for the first time in human history, over half of the world had regular access to the internet. This is a huge shift in how people interact with each other and are able to find work. However, it is still worth noting that even if over half the world have regular access to the internet, that still means that just under half the world don't have regular access to the internet. And it's also worth thinking about how that connectivity is differentiated. Think about how all of you access the internet, but then think about how people who don't own a computer might access the internet. Think about the different costs to get online, how regular it is, what kind of experience you have online. With the Uber drivers we spoke to in South Africa, many of them pay as much as 20% of their income on data, which compared to London is a 5, 6, 7, 8 times as much of their income to be able to be online. And so thinking about those differences in connectivity is still very important. And so for many people finding work online, it's not sitting in a cafe drinking flat whites or lattes and working on a MacBook, which is often the image we're given in the UK of what online work is going to be like. The experience is much more like this, working in what is essentially a kind of factory, a cloud work factory. Rows of computers, most of them secondhand from the global north. This is in northern Kenya. People accessing the internet and completing those kinds of tasks that we do when we do capture. So completing short image recognition tasks. And what's interesting about this is many people, so does anybody know when you look at an image on a capture and you have to say, identify the car in this picture, identify the person, do you know what you're doing when you do that with capture? Yeah.
Actually, when they're trying to verify that you're not a robot, things are good on Google, basically they're just trying to make you identify the door numbers or the car that's right. The Google Street View actually captures.
Yeah.
So basically they're letting us do free image recognition work to make their AI.
Yeah. And so when we're doing things about cars, so like identify the car or identify the person, does anybody know what you're training?
Yeah, so object recognition.
And what's the object recognition for?
Artificial intelligence, driving cars.
Driving cars, self-driving cars is what you're doing essentially. Is you're training algorithms that can help a self-driving car know whether something is a risk on the road or not. If you're doing numbers and so on, it tends to be identifying things on Google Maps. Yeah, so Google Maps knows what it is. But when you're looking at images and saying, this is a small child, you're essentially trying to help a self-driving car realize that it shouldn't run that over because it's a small child and so on. Now, what's interesting about this is we might know this, if we have an interest academically in understanding these things. But if you talk to people who work in these kind of cloud work factories and you say, what are you doing? And so I'm looking at pictures and I'm saying what's in them. It's okay, do you know what you're doing that for? I say, of course I don't. Who would tell me why I'm doing this? I just do this meaningless task over and over and over again and I get paid. And so the reason I want to bring this up is to think about how alienating this kind of work is. You know, when we're revising for our exams or we're writing papers or whatever we're doing, we have a sense of what that work is building towards. I mean, hopefully with the revision, it's building towards you getting a better mark and so on. But usually at work, we have a sense of what we're doing. Whereas if you're doing this kind of work, you're never explaining what the broader context is. And so one of the things that Mark, when he was doing the field work here, saw workers doing is looking at aerial pictures and identifying in the image with an arrow which direction people were running in. Now that, and of course we can't say this for certain because the people who organised the Cloudwork factory wouldn't tell you, but there are only a few uses for identifying which direction somebody is running in an aerial photo.
Warfare.
I mean, perhaps it's to drop food packages so they land at people's feet when they're running away from something, but more likely it's for warfare, for drone warfare. And so many people are engaged in work that if you told lots of people, we want you to help train an algorithm that's going to bomb villages and kill people, people would say, no way, I don't want to do that. But by not telling people what it's used for, people can end up working in all manner of things that they might not otherwise have chosen to do. And so on many of these websites, we see how the intermediary faces the requester on one hand and the worker on the other hand in very, very different ways. If you've ever been on Amazon Mechanical Turk or Micro Workers or any of these websites, they often advertise themselves to employers as we have this huge workforce on demand. You know, they're skilled, they're fast workers, you can get the work completed very, very quickly. Well, one of the ways they ensure this is the case is they say if you're not happy with the work, you don't have to pay for it. And so this has often been a way of convincing companies that it's okay to outsource your work to an anonymous crowd of workers. And so, for example, on Amazon Mechanical Turk, if we decide to outsource the transcription from our interviews or something like that onto Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we get the data back and we're not happy with it, you can say, actually, I'm not going to pay for this. I don't think it's met my standard. And Amazon say, okay, that's your choice to do. And the worker has no way to appeal this. And so it's been estimated that on Amazon Mechanical Turk, around 20 to sometimes 25% of the work is unpaid. So people complete work and the requester says, I'm not happy with this. Now, we can see this in two ways. We could say, maybe the work isn't always up to scratch. Sounds like a lot of that work isn't up to scratch though. Or we could be a bit more cynical and say, well, perhaps companies know that they cannot pay for the work and build this into how they pay for it. So they don't pay for every third task. And so in reality, what happens on a lot of these platforms is something that we would commonly understand as wage theft. Employing people and not paying them for their work becomes institutionalized into the platform. So people who are relying on this income end up seeing their overall weekly income or whatever it is drop by 20% because of that unpaid work. And so when we look at this on a global scale, you might not be surprised to see where the work is being completed. Often the work patterns follow traditional lines of imperialism, work being sent out from the UK, from Western Europe, from North America, to the global south to be completed, with huge numbers of crowdsourcing workers in India, in Bangladesh, in the Philippines, in South Africa, in Latin America, and most of the work coming from the global north. And one of the things that's important to pick out from this, so this is some data that my colleague Mark has gathered from one of the big online platforms, which shows how many potential workers there are on the platform. So in this platform, the potential global workforce was almost 1.8 million people So this is people who have profiles on the website, who are looking for work. But they found over a short period of time that only 200,000 people actually found work on the platform. So this means there is a relative oversupply of almost 1.6 million people. This is people who looked for work. Maybe they applied for jobs, but they didn't receive any paid work. And you can see on a country-by-country basis some of the differences between the potential workforce and the successful workforce are huge. In the Philippines, for example, 220,000 people trying to find work, only 33,000 people actually finding work. And so across this platform, you have people then competing to be successful. So if you're working in the Philippines and there are that many other workers bidding for work, it might then make sense to reduce your price. But then if there are this many people in Kenya, Nigeria and South Africa also competing for work, if the cost of living is lower in your country, it might make sense to decrease your price even a bit more. And so what we end up with is this huge oversupply of labour online drives down the amount of money that people receive for the work. Which means people increasingly earn less and less from this kind of online work. One of the other things that happens with this work is that if you're completing tasks in the Philippines for American companies, you need to be online and awake at the time when American workers are awake and online. And so this probably isn't very clear, but this is a kind of time diary. And essentially what it's showing is a worker shifting their work patterns to match American companies. Because when Americans come online and start posting work, if you're asleep, you're not going to get that work. And so not only is online work reshaping patterns of work on a global level, it's also reshaping how people work, what times they work, and adding those extra demands to this form of work. So what I want to do now is just to show a couple of quotes from fieldwork about the experience of this kind of work. Now the first is from a Nigerian worker who said that most people, he said most Filipinos, they work for 50 cents. He said it's so embarrassing, you're a professional, you know how to do this job, and she just wants to get a job. It's really affecting those ones that know how to do the job. And so what you see here is a Nigerian worker who traditionally has worked for more than a Filipino worker, earned more of a wage, is feeling undercut by Filipino workers, is no longer able to earn the kind of living they were previously. But of course, rather than complaining about the American requester who's putting that work on, they're seeing that the problem is the Filipino worker who's also trying to find work in that way. And so this kind of online work creates new divisions and competitions between different kinds of workers. And what we found, so this has come out in an almost unreadable way, is that survey respondents that we spoke to on these kinds of platforms spent an average of 18 hours a week browsing, applying, and reading about jobs. So in order to work on these platforms, people on average had to put in 18 hours of unpaid work. So that's essentially a part-time job is required just to find out about this work, just to apply for this work.
Excuse me, what was the sample again?
So this comes from a survey of African, it's mainly Kenya, I think Filipino workers that Mark carried out. So I'm going to say it was a perfectly valid sample size and had enough people in it, but I don't know the exact details, but I can find out for you. But this is a story that we hear commonly. It's people saying the amount of time you have to put into this is significant. You know, if you want to get these jobs, you have to spend time looking for them. And as a worker that we spoke to in South Africa said, if you had another choice, I don't think you would be sitting here behind a computer. They summarized their experience of this work quite clearly. If I could do something else, I wouldn't be here. And as the Vietnamese worker said to us, for the employer on a digital labour platform, it's very hard to deal with the plan with them. Now, what they're talking about here is the communication issues that many workers have on these platforms. So Nu said that they tried to write a lot of questions, tried to ask more about the work, but they could not answer because they don't want to answer. They say they want us to develop this and apply into the system, but we actually don't know what the big picture is. So for many of these small tasks, if you're only paying a few cents for a task, you're not going to sit and answer questions that workers have about a job. You say either you do it or you don't. This means the experience for people like Nu is applying for a job and maybe you don't quite know what you're meant to be doing. A confusing process. If you're not told about what the larger job is, what you're contributing into, it's then difficult to know what your small job should be doing. If you're writing a small piece of code or you're designing a small piece of something, without that greater knowledge, the work process becomes confusing and alienating. It also becomes a very stressful and difficult kind of work. As Wilson, a Ghanaian worker, said, there have been days where I stayed up for 2 days with no sleep at all, not even 30 minutes of sleep, because there's a project. I have to get it done. The pay is shit, but you have to get it done. And so after all that unpaid work to find a job, if you get one of these platforms, you have to make sure that you finish it on time. So that might mean not working for most of the week, getting some work and working non-stop to make sure it's finished. On many of the larger platforms, people are rated by how they do their work. So you want to make sure that you've got a high rating. That means completing the work quickly, efficiently, to ensure that you're able to get more work in the future. And for many people, this can be quite isolating. So Mohammed, a Nigerian worker, said, you're alone in your cubicle with the sound of a keyboard as your companion. Even people who go into these kinds of cloud work factories, or they come into an office to use a computer, are essentially working alone. They're not collaborating with colleagues. Like Nu, they might even find it difficult to have questions answered. And so this kind of online work becomes incredibly fractured and isolated. Now, it's worth noting that this is very different to taxi work or delivery work. So I've been doing field work with Deliveroo, which is like Zomato or Swiggy or Uber Eats, so a kind of large European platform that delivers food. I've been doing field work with drivers at Deliveroo for almost 3 years now, and they don't have this feeling of being alone in a cubicle with just the sound of a keyboard. If you go to London, you see Deliveroo drivers everywhere. We don't quite know how many there are, but we estimate something like 10 or 12,000. And in London, there are 40,000 to 50,000 Uber drivers just in the city. And so everywhere you go, you see these workers. And if I can see these workers as I go around the city, you can be sure that they can see each other as they go around the city. If you go to a popular street of restaurants, you see clumps of delivery drivers hanging out together, talking, sharing stories. Invariably in the UK, joining WhatsApp groups to share experiences of the work and to complain about it and so on. But the story I want to tell about Deliveroo is Mumit is a driver who, one of the first drivers I met at Deliveroo. He doesn't actually work for Deliveroo. He's self-employed, although he only works for Deliveroo. So arguably he's employed by them. And Mumit's been involved in 3 different accidents whilst I've known him. And in one of the accidents he described like this. He said, Deliveroo don't care if you have an accident. It's got nothing to do with them. because you're an independent contractor. This is the name for the status in the UK of self-employment. So you have to deal with your own things. They don't care. They'll sign you off for the shift until you can get back. They'll say get back in touch with us, and that's all through a call center as well. Not even through a person who's like actually a person who's even pretending to give, and you can fill in the Creative London swearing that he added in after that. Now, what Mumit's talking about here, he used to drive a motorbike to deliver food, and he was hit by a car. He broke his leg and his foot, and the front of his motorbike was kind of destroyed. Now, he was in shock, and he was lying on the pavement, and he called Deliveroo and said, "Oh, I've had an accident, I don't know what to do." And they said, "Oh, where are you?" And he gave them the address and so on. And Deliveroo sent another rider to the accident spot to collect the food to go and deliver it to the customer. And this is when he then called them up and said, what are you doing? They said, well, it's got nothing to do with us. You don't work for us. And they actually said to him, I'm going to have to go to hospital. And they said, yeah, that's fine. We'll deactivate you for now, which is the equivalent of being fired. And they said, when you're better, you just give us a call and we'll reactivate you. No offer to call an ambulance, to pay for any of the costs, to replace the motorbike. And so this kind of location-specific work brings with it huge numbers of additional risks. And I want to tell one other story, which I think summarizes this kind of work. Whenever anybody asks, in the UK we use the term gig economy for this kind of work. I don't know if people are familiar with that. It's sometimes a bit specific, which is to give this idea that you're no longer employed, but you're just doing small gigs. You might work for Uber for a bit and then deliver to Deliveroo or whatever. And another driver who, actually the first driver I ever met, we had done a series of interviews over a couple of years, and in one of them I said to him, I've never asked you this before, but what's the most difficult thing about doing this kind of work? What's the thing that kind of you find most challenging or whatever? Because he always used to talk about the things he hated about the work and so on. But as what's the most important thing about it? And he kind of paused for a while, and then he said, the most difficult thing for me delivering food on a platform is I wake up in the morning. I'm not really a morning person, so I try and eat some toast, but often I don't eat any food in the morning. I go to my first job. He worked in a library, bookshop. He said, I work in the bookshop until lunchtime. I then leave the bookshop and I deliver food for other people's lunches over lunchtime. Sometimes I eat a sandwich. If I can, I try and eat something on the way. I then go back to my third job, which was working in a cafe. And he would work that job until the evening, and then he would cycle to deliver food for other people in the evening. And he said, the hardest thing for me is once I've finished that evening shift, maybe 10 o'clock, I go home, and the hardest thing is eating enough calories when I'm home and tired to get up the next morning to repeat the whole process. And I think in that, the kind of deep irony is somebody who is paid to deliver food for people who are too busy or too tired to cook food themselves, finds the most difficult thing is finding enough time to cook enough food for himself to be able to go back out and repeat the process. It's a kind of damning indictment of the gig economy in lots of ways. But I think what it also shows is, I don't know how Zomato or Swiggy are advertised in India, but these kind of platforms in the UK have glossy adverts of young people eating sushi or avocado on toast, or looking young and fashionable and rich, and like they're kind of loving their day off and not having to work and so on. The reality is what most people use these platforms for is to order cheap food when they've been working too hard. And so this kind of work supports everybody else's overwork. Rather than being a kind of luxury item for many people, it becomes a way to work even harder yourself. And so all of these things led Mark and I to think about what role research could play in thinking through some of the challenges of this kind of work. So clearly there are some emerging issues here. Pay is a huge problem for most people. The minimum wage means little if you're completing work internationally. It means little if you're self-employed. Many people have to pay their own costs. Have to pay for a bicycle and moped, a car, insurance, and so on. The conditions can be very, very difficult. You might be doing these short online tasks that can be very, very stressful. You might be doing content moderation, spending your day looking at things deemed too unpleasant for other people to look at on the internet. You might be driving on the roads, putting yourself at much more risk of accidents. Contracts is a huge emerging issue. Again, to talk about my granddad, the idea for him that you would work for a company like Uber and not be given a contract would just blow his mind, because to him that would obviously be an employer. And so many people don't even have the basic rights that have been won at work over the past couple of 100 years. They're not even employed by many of these companies. This means when things go wrong, workers have very little way to challenge what's happened. The fourth emerging issue is questions around management. So what does it mean to be constantly rated by clients? One of the fascinating things about doing interviews with Uber drivers is, if anybody's ever done this, you do interviews in the back of an Uber or an Ola or whatever, is the moment you tell somebody, I'm going to give you 5 stars, whatever we talk about, suddenly they're not so happy with the company, or suddenly they want to talk to you about all manner of different things, is the rating system structures our interaction on these platforms. We're constantly thinking about what we're saying and what they're saying, so we can each reciprocally rate each other at the end of the process. Think about what this means for the Uber driver. If you're having a bad day, you still have to be on your best performance. You still have to ask the customer how they're doing, offer them a bottle of water, make them feel at home in the taxi or so on. And in the UK, this is quite an unusual experience, because before Uber, taxi drivers did one of 3 things. They didn't talk to you, they were rude to you, or they complained about the weather and politics. These were the only kinds of conversations you could have in the back of a cab. That was it. Maybe football, maybe, but if you support different teams, that conversation might not be that good for either person. But now when you get into an Uber, oh, how's your day going? How are you doing? Oh, love, blah, 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 blah. But never politics. Because if you're an Uber driver, you don't want to bring up politics with your client and find out you disagree, because they might give you 1 star. Whereas if you do the rating, suddenly these things open up much more. So it's just something to think about in terms of how people are managed. There's also the fact it's no longer about being fired or losing your job, but just a matter of being deactivated. For many people, there's no way to know whether you could lose your job or not. And more importantly, there's very little way to challenge if you lose your job. So for many, again, to use Uber and Ola, if a customer complains about you on these platforms, you're usually suspended immediately, and then the platform talks to the customer. There's very little way for a driver to say, well, the customer was behaving badly, or the customer was very rude. It's very difficult for the worker to challenge decisions made about them. And then finally, there's an issue with representation. How do workers have a voice in this kind of work?
Unions.
We hope so, but in many places, there's no union for Upwork. There's no union for Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. And in many parts of the world, so I think this is where one of the differences between geographically, where workers have to be in a place and where workers don't have to be in a place. It's very, very difficult for unions to organize workers who can be working all over the world online. It's much easier for unions to organize workers who have to be in a particular place. But what we see is in many countries, the traditional taxi drivers opposing Uber or Ola or whatever equivalent there are, and so not including them within their traditional representation structures. People might be able to correct me, but I believe there's only one city in the world where existing taxi drivers collaborate with Uber drivers, which is New York City, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. Everywhere else, there's tensions between the two, so much so that in many places, traditional taxi drivers will attack or smash the windows of Uber cars, drive them away from the airport and so on. This is the case in France, in Argentina, in Brazil, which makes it quite difficult for these drivers to have representation.
How do they know somebody is driving Uber? Sticker.
Yeah, they often have a sticker.
Is that a mandate? Yeah.
Yes, although in some places now they don't. So this is something I always think about when I get into Uber in a different country. Is in the UK, you always sit in the back of a taxi. You never ever sit in the front of a taxi. It's just a kind of strange unwritten rule. So much so that some taxis in the UK don't have a seat in the passenger side in the front. They take the seat out for some reason. In some countries, if you go and take an Uber, they ask you to sit in the front because then it doesn't look like an Uber. So if you get an Uber in the airport in Argentina, they ask you to sit in the front so that the meter taxi drivers don't know that you're an Uber. So in some cases, people try and hide the fact that they're Uber drivers. Yeah, there was a hand at the back. You sure? Okay.
I'd like to add something. During my fieldwork in Kanpur and Lucknow, what I found out, in Lucknow there was an organized protest with Uber drivers. But from Kanpur we didn't have an airport over there, so we had to travel to Lucknow to get in flight. So I was traveling from Kanpur to Lucknow, and this person says that he cancels my ride and says, I'm not going to go to Lucknow. I said, why? You're not going to go to Lucknow. He said, there's a protest there, and they're smashing all the Ola cars who are traveling from Kanpur to Lucknow. And these both are people in the same platform, but still there is so much antagonism in between them. It's very common in India as well. Right?
Yeah, and in South Africa, the meter taxi drivers have burnt Uber cars. They've ordered Uber cars to them to beat the driver up and to smash up the cars and so on. So this causes major problems for representation. So in the UK, there's a trade union for taxi drivers, which is part of the second biggest trade union in the country. And their position with Uber is that it should be banned. And they lobby the local government to ban Uber. This means, of course, they're not trying to recruit these Uber drivers or to unionize them because they see them as a problem rather than another group of workers. So what this means is for many people in the gig economy, if they want that kind of collective representation, they have to do it themselves. And often what this means is when drivers meet each other, they join WhatsApp groups, they talk about what they don't like about the work and so on. This becomes the embryo of a new form of representation. You know, how people get in touch with each other. In some cases, this develops into a trade union. So in the UK, Uber drivers are a part of a small trade union. In South Africa, they have a network. But one of the problems is, traditionally speaking, self-employed people are not allowed to be in trade unions. So in the US, the Teamsters union started organizing Uber drivers, and Uber took them to court saying they were running a price-setting cartel, which is the equivalent of all the self-employed businesses coming together and deciding to fix their rates. And so this problem with employment status has a huge knock-on effect with representation. Is in many cases, self-employed people can't have a union. So they can't use those traditional channels to ask for higher wages or better conditions and so on.
Why not?
In most countries, yeah, I don't know what the law is in India, but in the UK, in most of Europe, in North America, it's illegal for self-employed people to have a union. Sometimes they can have an association, but that's usually to do training or to lobby the government or these kinds of things. Now, this of course doesn't stop protests strikes, and so on emerging, but they emerge in a very different way because they're not mediated by a trade union. So technically, the union in London is not recognised by Uber. Uber have never said the name of this trade union. They would never negotiate with it. Because if they were to negotiate, the union could then have the self-employed status overturned. So you end up with this kind of bind that emerges. So these are the kinds of emerging issues. These are, of course, felt very differently in the global north to the global south. Generally speaking, the global north, these platforms are experienced as a degradation of working conditions, of people moving out of formal employment and into these kinds of roles, lower protections, lower wages, and so on, generally speaking. In lots of the global south, this is experienced as a movement out of informal work, and so it might have some improved conditions in various ways, but allows people to escape previous labour market conditions. The outcome for both is still negative in most cases, but it comes from different previous positions, broadly speaking. And so one of the solutions that we've tried to develop to this is to think about how academic research could contribute to understanding and improving some of the conditions of this kind of work. And so Mark and I work on a project, Fair Work project, which is funded by the German Development Agency, which is to try and think about ways that conditions could be improved. And IIITB were very kind to host us earlier this year for a stakeholder meeting, because we're focusing both on India and South Africa. And what we have developed is a 10-point scoring system. So platforms can get a score for meeting basic standards on pay and then an improved standard. So kind of 2 points for each. Is rating all of these platforms in terms of how they perform in fairness. So how fair is it for the worker who finds work on these platforms? Now the idea here is threefold. The first is to highlight to workers that some of these platforms have very different conditions to others. Now this is important, I think, for the second reason, is many of these platforms, if you look at Uber and Ola or Uber and Taxify or the different transport platforms, is some of them do offer different things. So in South Africa, Taxify take 10% less of a cut than Uber do. And so highlighting some of these better practices can provide a way for that representation to think about what could be won on a platform. If one delivery platform provides insurance, why doesn't the other one? That these could become minimum standards that workers could ask for on platforms. Now, the second part of this is thinking about how platforms themselves could be leveraged. And I think, to give you an example of how this has worked so far in South Africa, is we've met with a whole number of platforms in South Africa and have shown them their score and said, you've performed this well, this badly in most cases, and said, we're going to publicize your score and we're going to compare you to all the other platforms in South Africa. We're going to do this early next year, and said, you have some time until this happens. You could make some changes and that would improve your score. Now, what's interesting is that by not employing these workers, lots of platforms have a huge issue with churn. It's very easy for an Uber driver to go and work for Ola or to switch from one delivery platform to another. And so lots of platforms are worried about competing platforms taking away their market share, either in terms of customers or workers. And so in South Africa, lots of platforms were prepared to make some relatively substantial changes to ensure that they came out as the most fair platform. And so what we're trying to do with this is leverage research to open up spaces where workers can think about how they can shape their conditions at work. And this has always been something that has changed historically. Last time I'm going to use the granddad example. But thinking about my granddad, who worked He worked 2 jobs in his whole life. He worked on the railways and he worked in a hospital. These were very traditional kinds of workplaces. They had unions, they had specific sites you went to every day. You could make sense of them very easily. Workers fought and transformed those kinds of workplaces into better places to work. Think about the service industry that came in and took many of those jobs. Think about how people are beginning to find ways to improve that kind of work. What we're talking about with platform work is, in a sense, the future of work. But the future of work is a funny concept in lots of ways. Because it's not really a future of work if people are starting to work it. It's becoming the present for many, many people. But it still retains that future aspect in that many of the conditions are not set. What will it be like to work for Uber in 5 years' time? What will it be like to work for Zomato or Amazon Mechanical Turk? It's thinking about how worker voice needs to be integrated critically into